Summer, 1878. The blistering sun hung heavy over the Nebraska territory, turning the dust of the Oregon Trail into a suffocating cloud. It was a trail paved with broken dreams and desperate hope. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, oxen, and the metallic tang of fear, a scent most travelers tried to ignore. Elias Vance, the cartographer, was hired to map the less-traveled forks of the trail, but his focus had shifted from geography to the gruesome rumors. Reports of travelers found dead, their wagons untouched, their bodies bearing a horrifying signature. Both eyes surgically and brutally removed. Elias, a man of logic, rejected the easy answer of hostile natives. The wounds were too precise, too methodical. He believed it was the work of a twisted individual or a small organized group exploiting the prevailing fear. That evening, the small convoy, led by the grizzled wagon master Jedediah, settled near a creek. Elias was speaking with Sarah, a young woman traveling west, about the unsettling pattern of the attacks. He had just explained that the attack seemed personal, a message, when a sharp metallic clang echoed from the edge of the camp. The camp fell silent. When the immediate danger seemed to pass, Elias spotted something near the creek bank, a small, intricately carved wooden doll. It had no eyes. The sockets were two small, perfectly hollowed-out holes. On the back, etched deeply into the wood, was a single disturbing symbol, a stylized, broken compass. Elias showed the doll to Jedediah, who confirmed his darkest fear. We're being watched, and whoever's doing the watching ain't after our supplies. The clang had been a deliberate distraction. The doll was a deliberate, horrifying message. The narrative of random violence was crumbling, revealing a focused, calculated human malice hiding in the shadows of the American West. Elias realized he was no longer a detached observer. He was now the recipient of a direct, terrifying threat. The next morning, the terror intensified. As the sun rose, Elias found a second message pinned to his wagon wheel with a rusted spike. It was a fragment of a map, drawn on rough hide, showing a specific unused trail that branched off the main Oregon Trail, a path Elias himself was supposed to survey. Scrawled below the trail marker in a spidery, unsettling hand were two words: "Follow the path." Panic gripped the camp. Frank, the nervous traveler, demanded they turn back immediately. "This ain't no warning, Vance. This is a death warrant. They want you." "They want me to follow their path," Elias corrected, his voice tight. His cartographer's instinct warred with his survival instinct. To leave the path was to save himself. To follow it was to find the truth, and perhaps the killer. Jedediah, though clearly shaken, placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. "Son, the folks who travel this trail, we ain't turning around. Not for gold, and damn sure not for some superstitious threat. But we ain't going down that fork. It's too dangerous. We stick to the main route." Elias knew he had to separate from the convoy. The killer was targeting those who ventured onto the unused paths, and now specifically him. If he stayed, he put everyone at risk. Sarah, sensing his decision, approached him later as he was packing his smaller supplies. "You're going, aren't you?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with dread. "I have to, Sarah. They've invited me. If I don't follow, they'll just keep leaving these calling cards. And the next one might not be a doll." He paused, looking directly at her. "I need to know why. Why the eyes? Why the compass?" "The compass," Sarah whispered, touching the drawing he had copied into his notebook. "It looks broken, like it points nowhere or everywhere." "Exactly. A cartographer's nightmare, a broken direction, but that's the key. This person or group is obsessed with direction and sight. They are taking the traveler's ability to see the path, literally and symbolically." Elias secured his rifle and checked his supplies. He left a note for Jedediah, claiming he was simply scouting ahead and would meet them in 3 days at the next post. It was a lie, but it was the only way to leave without causing a mutiny. As he rode his lone mule away from the main column, the sun now high and unforgiving, he felt the heavy weight of the plains pressing in on him. The fear of the unknown was replaced by the certainty of a confrontation with calculated human evil. He was alone, guided only by a fragment of a horrifying map and the image of a broken compass. His journey into the true horror of the Wild West had just begun. If you've made it this far, the terror has only just begun. Don't let this journey end here. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single chapter of Elias's terrifying pursuit of the truth behind the Macabre Voyages. Elias rode for a day and a half, the dust settling on his clothes and his soul. The heat was relentless, a physical oppression that mirrored the psychological weight of his task. He constantly scanned the horizon, the rocky outcrops and the dense pockets of scrub oak, knowing he was a single target moving directly toward his hunters. The broken compass symbol, copied and recopied in his notebook, had become an anchor of dread. He realized the killer wasn't merely hiding in the wilderness. They were using the vastness and the isolation as their primary tool. Finally, he reached the point indicated on the scrap of hide, a faint overgrown track veering sharply north from the established Oregon Trail. The grass was higher here, and the wagon ruts were shallow, suggesting it had been unused for years. It was exactly the type of unseen path he was hired to map, and precisely the type of path where the victims had disappeared. Before committing, Elias stopped and meticulously scouted the area. He dismounted, tied his mule, and began a wide perimeter search. He wasn't looking for a war camp or a band of thieves. He was looking for the subtle signs of a methodical stalker. Broken twigs, scuffed rock, anything that didn't belong to the natural environment. Near a cluster of boulders that offered a commanding view of the main trail, he found it. Not a footprint, but a small, carefully placed cairn of stones. It was too deliberate to be random. He dismantled it slowly, and beneath the bottom stone, he found a small piece of dark, aged cloth, a fragment of a uniform perhaps, or a specific type of worker's clothing. He tucked it away. More disturbingly, 100 yards further into the abandoned fork, he discovered something that confirmed the sheer chilling organization of his antagonist. A series of small, shallow, disguised pits had been dug into the trail itself, designed not to trap a large animal or a wagon wheel, but to trip a single rider. Tripwires. Whoever was here was thinking like a military strategist, not a desperate raider. He spent the next 3 hours carefully navigating the first mile of the fork, disarming or noting every subtle trap. The atmosphere was thick with silence, the kind of silence that feels deliberate, like the world is holding its breath. The psychological effect of knowing that every footfall was anticipated, every turn potentially fatal, was a greater source of exhaustion than the heat. As the sun began its descent, Elias found the first clear sign of a recent encampment. It was small, well hidden, and expertly scrubbed clean. He noted the type of firewood used, the faint scent of stale tobacco, and, most importantly, a single deep impression in the hard-packed earth. A boot print that was too large and too perfectly formed for the average traveler. It was a high-quality, custom-made boot, the kind a man of means, not a desperate vagrant, would wear. This discovery was a revelation. The perpetrator was not a savage from the periphery, but a man from the center of civilization. This was a sophisticated, well-funded killer, or killers, operating under the guise of the Wild West's inherent dangers. The broken compass wasn't a warning from a mythical group. It was the insignia of a secret society, a cult of personality, or a deadly enterprise preying on the weak. He realized his initial premise was flawed. He wasn't tracking one killer, he was tracking a system. He pressed on until darkness made further travel impossible, setting up a minimal camp in a thicket of willows near a dried-up riverbed, far from the actual trail. He ate cold rations, his senses on a razor's edge. He pulled out his notebook, and drew the boot print, the cairn, the cloth fragment, and the broken compass. He began to synthesize the clues. 1. Target profile. Isolated, non-wealthy travelers, not robbery. 2. Method. Precision, surgical eye removal, psychological terror. 3. Organization. Tripwires, expert concealment, specific insignia, broken compass. 4. Perpetrator. Profile. Educated, well-equipped, possibly affluent, custom boots. The horror was shifting from a legend to a terrifying, concrete reality. The legend of the eye-gouging Apaches was a perfect camouflage, but the true enemy was a civilized predator using the lawless landscape as a cloak. Just as he was about to extinguish his small lantern, a sound cut through the night. A faint, deliberate whistle echoing from the ridge high above his position. It was a complex, repeating 5-note sequence. It wasn't a warning. It was a signal. Elias froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. They knew he was here. They had watched him disarm the traps. They were communicating. And the melody, though simple, had a strange, haunting familiarity. He gripped his rifle, realizing the signal was the sound of the trap closing around him. The hunter had become the hunted. Deep within the fork of the trail they had commanded him to follow. The whistle repeated twice more from the ridge before the silence returned, heavier and more menacing than before. Elias didn't move. He hadn't fired a shot. He hadn't even shown the light of his lantern for more than a few seconds. Yet, they knew exactly where he was. The implication was stark. They had a system of observation far more advanced than he had anticipated. He spent the rest of the night in a state of hypervigilance, moving his position 3 times, never truly sleeping. When the first hint of dawn appeared, painting the eastern sky in bruised purples, Elias began his ascent toward the ridge, abandoning the mule and packing only essential gear. He had to understand the signaling system. The climb was grueling. The ground was loose and the rocks sharp. When he finally reached the high point, he found the perfect vantage point, a small, natural rock shelter, but no one was there. He searched the area meticulously, finding evidence of a recent, protracted stay. Flattened grass, discarded provisions, and 2 things that were profoundly unnerving. The first was a small, high-powered telescope, a brass instrument of exceptional quality, strategically mounted to offer an uninterrupted view of the trail for miles, including his campsite. This confirmed the sophistication of the group. The second item was lying beneath the telescope stand, partially buried. A worn, leather-bound book. It wasn't a Bible or a travelogue, it was a book of musical notation. He flipped through it quickly. The score was amateur but precise, filled with complex, cryptic arrangements. One particular set of notes, circled in red ink, matched the 5-note sequence he had heard the previous night. Beneath the notes, someone had scrawled a single word. Interference. Interference. Elias whispered to himself. His arrival, his investigation, was not just noted. It was categorized as a disruption to their operation. He pocketed the book and the cloth fragment from Chapter 2. The telescope he smashed against a rock to prevent its immediate use. He then started down the ridge, his path now directed not by the map, but by the logic of his adversaries. They were using signals. They were organized. They were educated. He followed the faint footprints away from the ridge. The prints were distinct, not just the large boot print he had already noted, but a second, smaller, more delicate impression, likely belonging to a woman or a younger man. The group was comprised of at least 2 people. The trail led him to a narrow, hidden canyon, a natural funnel that would force any traveler to slow down and concentrate their focus. And there, tucked into a deep crevice, he found the cache. It was a small canvas-covered pit containing supplies that explained the longevity of their operation. Tins of preserved food, medical supplies, including surgical tools that made Elias's stomach turn, fresh water bladders, and most chillingly, a sealed wooden box. Elias pried the box open. Inside, nestled on a bed of dry moss, were 5 pairs of human eyes. They were preserved, not dried or decomposed, but perfectly, disturbingly intact in a clear, oily liquid. They were the trophies, the evidence of the Macabre Voyages. They were the reality behind the myth. Overcome by a wave of nausea and cold dread, Elias forced himself to remain methodical. He wasn't dealing with a simple murderer, but a collector, a person with an intensely specific ritualistic motivation. This wasn't about the act of murder, it was about the acquisition of the eyes. He closed the box, replacing it exactly as he found it. Taking the eyes would alert them instantly. Instead, he took samples of the preserving liquid and a small, unused surgical scalpel that bore a distinct, tiny scratch mark near the handle. As he was documenting the cache, he heard a new sound, the faint creak of wagon wheels far off in the canyon. It wasn't a signal, it was an approach. The group was returning. Elias had minutes, maybe seconds. He scrambled up the sheer rock face of the crevice, finding a narrow ledge just wide enough to conceal him. He lay flat, covering himself with dusty scrub, his rifle trained on the canyon floor. The sounds grew louder. The wagon was a modest covered carriage, not the heavy freight wagons common on the main trail. It was driven by a man in a clean, dark suit, wearing the custom-made boots. He had a stern, aristocratic profile and a long, neatly trimmed beard. The epitome of a respectable, educated traveler. This was the man of means. Sitting beside him was the source of the smaller boot print, a young woman, perhaps early 20s. She was dressed simply but neatly, and she carried a drawing pad, on which she was constantly sketching. Her face was pale, her expression one of quiet, almost numb exhaustion. The man slowed the wagon directly in front of the cache. He looked up toward Elias's hiding spot on the ridge, the very place where the telescope had been, and then glanced around the canyon with an unsettlingly calm, assessing gaze. He seemed to know that something was wrong. The woman didn't look up. She kept sketching, her pale, delicate fingers moving rapidly. As the man stepped out of the wagon, Elias saw a flash of silver on his waistcoat. A small pin, meticulously crafted, shaped like the broken compass. The horror of the myth had materialized into 2 sophisticated, cold-blooded murderers. Elias was trapped above them, armed with only a handful of clues, staring directly into the face of the organized human evil he had sought to expose. His breath hitched as the man began to unload a shovel. They were about to bury or retrieve their cache. The man in the dark suit, the one Elias instantly pegged as the leader, was meticulously organized. He didn't rush. He opened the cache, inspecting the contents with a cold, proprietary air. The young woman remaining in the wagon continued her frantic sketching. Elias watched, his mind racing. He was one man against 2 organized killers. A direct confrontation would be suicidal. His goal wasn't just survival, it was evidence and exposure. He needed to know their names, their motive, and their final destination. The man retrieved a small, sealed bottle from the wagon and added a few drops of a clear solution to the preservation jar of eyes. As he did so, he let his gaze linger on the ridge, a subtle, almost imperceptible turn of the head. He was testing the silence, looking for the disruption that his signals had categorized as interference. Suddenly, the man looked directly toward Elias's hiding spot. Not at Elias himself, but at a cluster of pebbles that Elias had inadvertently disturbed while scrambling up the crevice. The man's eyes, cold and calculating, narrowed slightly. He didn't draw a gun. He didn't shout. Instead, he spoke in a calm, surprisingly well-modulated voice, the voice of an educated orator. "I detect a deviation in the stillness, Professor. A small disturbance in our meticulously constructed tableau." He addressed the invisible observer as Professor, a direct reference to Elias's background as a cartographer and surveyor. They had done their homework. They knew who he was. The woman in the wagon finally looked up, her eyes wide with a fragile terror that seemed at odds with her role as an accomplice. She met the man's gaze, a look that instantly silenced her. The man continued, slowly removing a pair of leather gloves. "We appreciate a dedication to the craft of observation. But all maps must eventually lead to a singular fixed point, and that point, Professor, is stillness. Absolute stillness." This monologue was a terrifying game. He was trying to draw Elias out, playing on his intellectual pride. Elias, sweating under the concealment of the brush, realized the gravity of his discovery. This was not random murder. This was a philosophical, ritualistic enterprise, a terrifying perversion of knowledge and control. The man, clearly tired of the game, reached under the wagon seat and retrieved a heavy, short-barreled shotgun. He aimed it, not at the crevice, but at Elias's mule, which was tethered out of sight around the bend. The mule, their way of forcing his hand without having to search for him. Elias had a split second to act. If he allowed the mule to be killed, he would be stranded, his ability to escape or pursue them crippled. "Stop!" Elias shouted, his voice echoing sharply off the canyon walls as he emerged, rifle leveled from his cover. The man didn't flinch. He slowly lowered the shotgun, a small, knowing smile spreading across his lips. "Ah," the cartographer emerges from the shadows. "Welcome to the terminus of your path, Professor Vance." The woman gasped, dropping her drawing pad. "Who are you?" Elias demanded, his rifle steady. "Why the eyes? Why the compass?" "The eyes," the man stated calmly, gesturing to the cache with an open hand, "are a testament, a refusal to accept the chaos of the world. The world demands direction. The broken compass, you see, is a representation of all who wander aimlessly, all who refuse to see the true path. We are simply collecting the evidence of their failure." The twisted logic was chilling. They weren't just killers. They were self-appointed judges. "And you leave the Apache story to cover your cruelty," Elias spat out. "It is an effective narrative," the man conceded with a shrug. "It provides the illusion of untamed wilderness, allowing the true work to proceed unnoticed." Before Elias could press him further, the woman in the wagon moved. She didn't reach for a weapon. She reached for the drawing pad she had dropped and flipped it open. Her hand, moving with terrifying speed, snatched a heavy, sharp drafting pencil and slashed a deep gash across her own forearm. Blood welled instantly. She didn't cry out. She looked at Elias, her eyes wide and pleading, and then looked pointedly at her drawing pad. On the page, her last sketch was visible. A perfect, detailed drawing of a nearby massive rock formation, the Sentinel, and a small, nearly invisible arrow pointing to a narrow crevice at its base. It was a distraction, a self-inflicted injury to create chaos, and a clue. She was not a willing participant. She was a hostage who had just risked her life to give Elias a direction. The man, enraged by her betrayal, roared, "Judith, you fool!" and spun toward her. This was the opening. Elias didn't fire. He took the opportunity to sprint directly toward the wagon, covering the distance in 3 powerful strides. He crashed into the side of the carriage, disrupting the man's aim and creating a dust cloud. He grabbed the woman's arm, checking the wound, deep, but not immediately fatal. "The Sentinel," she hissed, her voice weak but fierce. "Go. He's Silas Vane, a disgraced medical lecturer from Philadelphia. He's keeping a ledger in the Sentinel's base." Elias pulled back, diving behind the wagon wheel as Silas Vane regained his composure. The shotgun blast tearing through the air where Elias's head had been moments before. The cartographer had the name, the motive, and the direction. The true voyage was about to begin. The shotgun blast echoed violently through the narrow canyon, showering Elias with dust and rock fragments. Silas Vane, enraged by his captive's betrayal and the cartographer's escape, was no longer calm. He fired a second, hasty shot, this one hitting the wagon's canvas, tearing a massive hole. Elias acted instantly. He pushed off the wagon wheel, sprinting across the canyon floor and scrambling up the rocky incline toward the largest rock formation. The Sentinel, the landmark Judith had indicated. He knew Vane would pursue him, but the shotgun was useless at this distance. As he ran, his mind processed the deluge of information. Silas Vane, a disgraced medical lecturer. The precision of the eye removal suddenly made chilling sense. It was surgical expertise warped by madness. The ledger he kept was likely a meticulously documented record of his victims, his failures. Vane, shedding his composure entirely, roared curses and began firing a pistol wildly. Elias ignored the bullets, focusing on the arrow Judith had sketched. He found the crevice. A narrow, nearly invisible vertical crack in the rock face, choked with scrub brush and loose stones. He squeezed inside, pulling his rifle after him. The crevice opened into a small, dark, circular cave. The air inside was cool and smelled of dry earth and old leather. There was no light, but Elias knew instinctively that this was the headquarters, the terminus Vane had spoken of. Using the faint light filtering from the entrance, Elias found a small, sturdy wooden chest tucked beneath a slab of rock. It wasn't locked. Inside, he found what he was looking for: the ledger. It was a heavy, bound book, filled not with accounting notes, but with beautiful, meticulous handwriting and chilling anatomical sketches. Elias quickly flipped through the pages. It wasn't just a record of names. It was a terrifying manifesto. Vane believed he had developed a revolutionary and clearly insane theory of perception. He believed that sight was not merely a physical process, but a moral one. His victims, the isolated travelers, were individuals who had lost their moral compass. They were aimless, directionless, and thus failed visionaries. The entries detailed their backgrounds: a failed prospector who had lost his fortune, a preacher who had abandoned his calling, a wife leaving her husband to find a new life. All were people in transition, at a moral or existential crossroads. Vane saw them as proof of his perverse theory, and by removing their eyes, he was culling the morally aimless from the great American journey. The broken compass was not merely a symbol of aimlessness, it was Vane's twisted insignia of judgment. Elias paused on the last entry, dated just 3 days prior. The victim was unnamed, but the description was painfully accurate. A young woman traveling west to meet a fiancé, often humming nervous tunes. It was a chilling portrait of Sarah, the kind young woman from the main convoy. Vane was ahead of them, observing the main trail, not just the fork. Suddenly, a massive shadow fell across the cave entrance. Silas Vane stood there, blocking the light, his pistol leveled. His calm was gone, replaced by a terrifying cold fury. "You've seen it," Vane stated, his voice flat. "The truth. The failures. Now you understand the necessity of our purification." "This isn't purification, Vane," Elias countered, clutching the ledger. "This is serial murder driven by a terrifying narcissism. You're not a judge. You're a monster, hiding your sickness behind a philosophical pretense." "Words," Vane sneered, "just like the words of those aimless fools who lost their vision. But the eyes, Professor, the eyes are the immutable truth." Vane took a menacing step forward. Elias raised his rifle. "I have the proof, Vane. Your ledger. I can expose you for the madman you are. You won't leave this cave," Vane promised, his finger tightening on the trigger. "The world will mourn a cartographer lost to a fall in the wilderness, his notes scattered to the wind, and the truth will remain with the righteous." Just as Vane was about to fire, a noise came from outside the crevice, a heavy scraping sound. Judith had returned. "Silas, stop!" Judith's voice was high and desperate. "The marshal, a patrol is coming." They heard the shots. "We have to leave." Vane hesitated, his eyes flickering between the sound of the approaching danger and the ledger in Elias's hand. His life's work, his twisted truth, was in danger of exposure. The sound of distant horses, faint but unmistakable, sealed his decision. With a look of pure hatred at Elias, Vane fired a shot, not at the cartographer, but at the rock directly above Elias's head, causing a shower of dust and stone. He turned and bolted from the entrance. Elias immediately scrambled out, the ledger tucked securely into his coat. He saw Vane helping the injured Judith climb onto the wagon. Vane didn't look back. He whipped the horses violently, turning the carriage not onto the main path, but plunging it directly into the thick, thorny scrubland, a desperate off-the-map escape. Elias had been saved, but the escape route Vane took was a path only a fanatic would choose. Elias had the evidence, the names, and the horrific motive. But Vane and Judith were now deep in the unmapped territory, their next destination unknown. Elias stood alone, holding the ledger, knowing that the most dangerous part of the chase had just begun, a pursuit across the vast, lawless, unmapped canvas of the American West. Elias spent the remainder of the day tracking Silas, Vane, and Judith. The marshals Judith had mentioned never materialized. It had been a brilliant, desperate lie to force Vane's hand. Elias respected her quick thinking, which had saved his life. The carriage tracks were difficult to follow. Vane was an expert at moving silently through rough terrain, deliberately choosing rock and hard clay to minimize disturbance. Elias, however, was a master cartographer, trained to see the minute changes in the landscape. He tracked them by broken twigs, displaced pebbles, and the infrequent deep rut of the custom-made wagon wheels. The trail led them deeper into the unexplored Western territories, away from any established town or settlement. As the sun set, painting the sky in a fiery display, the tracks became easier to follow, leading toward a distinctive, isolated mesa, a massive, flat-topped mountain that looked like a fortress rising from the plains. At the base of the mesa, Vane's tracks converged with a faint established road, a ghost road unmarked on any map, likely an old mining route. The sight of a structured path in this wilderness was jarring. It suggested a permanent, hidden community or structure. Elias pressed on until the moon was high and cold. He finally saw it. A small, well-maintained settlement tucked into a high, natural valley on the mesa's flank. It wasn't a town, it was a compound. A solid stockade fence protected a cluster of well-built wooden structures, including a large, central building that looked like a chapel or meeting hall. This was no mere hideout. This was Vane's sanctuary. Elias dismounted and tied his mule far away, approaching the compound on foot under the cover of darkness. The place was unnervingly silent. No dogs barked, no lights burned in the smaller structures, but a single powerful lantern illuminated the entrance of the central hall. He found a gap in the perimeter fence, expertly hidden by thick vines. He slipped inside. The atmosphere within the compound was oppressive. It was too neat, too quiet. He moved toward the central hall, staying low in the shadows. He could hear faint voices inside, a low, rhythmic chanting. He crept to a window and peered in. The scene inside confirmed his worst fears about Vane's operation. The large hall was filled with people, around 30 men and women, all dressed in plain, dark clothes, sitting in neat, silent rows. They were members of Vane's Society of Failed Visionaries, a cult. Silas Vane stood at the front, his custom boots shiny, his composure fully restored, lecturing to the silent congregation. He was holding up the preservation jar, containing the eyes. "They are the evidence," Vane proclaimed, his voice booming with religious fervor. "The proof that the path of the aimless leads only to the void. They lost their vision, and we, the true visionaries, must continue our work to prevent the moral infection from spreading to the sanctuary." Elias realized the true horror. Vane was not just killing, he was recruiting and radicalizing a community based on his perverted philosophy. The eye gouging was the ultimate ritual, the physical proof of his moral superiority. Elias scanned the room for Judith. She was sitting near the front, her head bowed, her injured arm bandaged and supported by a sling. She looked utterly defeated, a prisoner of this terrifying ideology. As Vane finished his sermon, he turned and placed the jar of eyes on a high shelf. Beneath the shelf lay a row of heavy, worn, leather-bound books, dozens of them. Elias recognized the size and shape. More ledgers. Vane wasn't the only one recording the failures. The cult was keeping a comprehensive, collaborative record of their victims and their twisted philosophy. Elias had to get those ledgers. They were the ultimate proof of the conspiracy and the key to understanding its full scope. Vane began to dismiss the congregation, instructing them to return to their meditations on the righteous path. As the members filed out, a tall, silent, powerfully built man with a severe expression, clearly Vane's chief enforcer, paused by the exit, his eyes sweeping the dark courtyard. Elias pressed himself flat against the wall, knowing a direct raid was impossible. He needed an inside distraction. He needed Judith. As the enforcer stepped out and began patrolling the perimeter, Vane was left alone in the hall, carefully organizing his supplies. Elias saw his chance. He needed to get a message to Judith to reignite her desperation and her courage. The fate of countless future travelers, and Elias's own life, depended on the actions of the terrified young woman trapped inside the madman's sanctuary. Elias watched Vane, now alone in the central hall, meticulously cleaning his surgical instruments, the same scalpel he had documented in the cache. The sight was stomach-churning. Vane was performing a ritual of preparation, perhaps for his next macabre voyage, or, horrifyingly, for a victim already within the compound. The chief enforcer was patrolling the exterior wall near Elias's position. The chance of slipping inside was minimal. Elias needed to act before Vane decided to lock up for the night. He took out the cloth fragment he had found beneath the cairn, Chapter 2, and the musical notation book, Chapter 3. He recognized the cloth, a simple, unbleached linen used for medical dressings. He scribbled a quick, urgent message on the cloth fragment with a charred twig. "I have the ledger," Vane confessed. "He is using you. Create a disturbance in the hall. The enforcer patrols the south wall, 15-min cycle, need 30 seconds. Look for the broken compass. V." He couldn't use his full name, but the initial V for Vance, combined with the specific mention of the broken compass symbol on Vane's lapel, might resonate with her. His plan was reckless. He would use the musical notation to signal her. He located the window of the small cabin where Judith was likely being held, which faced the back of the central hall. Elias found a loose, flat stone and positioned it carefully. He then began to tap out the rhythmic, 5-note sequence he had heard Vane's accomplice signal, the one labeled interference. He repeated it slowly, 4 times. He waited. Nothing. He repeated the sequence again, this time adding a slight variation at the end. A technique he had seen in the musical book, perhaps a signal for response. Finally, a faint, almost imperceptible response. A single, soft rap on the window pane of the small cabin. She had heard and recognized the signal. Elias then moved to the cabin wall, using the shadow of a water barrel as cover. He tossed the cloth, weighted with a small stone, so that it landed directly against her window. He retreated immediately to the main hall's window to watch Vane's reaction. A few minutes later, the door to Judith's cabin creaked open. She emerged, pale and hesitant, and walked quickly to the back of the main hall, her bandaged arm clutched close to her chest. She re-entered the hall, finding Vane still preoccupied with his instruments. "Silas," she said, her voice trembling but loud enough to carry through the open window. I need to ask you about the purpose." Vane looked up, annoyed. "The purpose is clear, Judith. The purification of the morally blind. You are injured." Go rest." "No," she insisted, taking a shaky step closer. "The people you killed. The last one. Sarah. She was kind. She was coming here to start a life. How can you judge a life that hasn't even begun?" Vane's face hardened into a mask of cruel condescension. "Sentimentality. That is what failed her. That is what makes you weak, Judith. You cannot see the logic of the moral vacuum she represented." Judith looked up at the high shelf where the eyes were kept, then toward the rows of ledgers. She was following Elias's instructions, creating a diversion, focusing on the evidence. "The logic is flawed, Silas." She suddenly cried out, a burst of raw, genuine defiance in her voice. "The path you follow, it's broken. You are the one with the failed vision." Vane exploded. "Silence!" He lunged at her, his composure shattering again. This was the distraction. As Vane grabbed Judith's good arm, shaking her violently, Elias moved. He smashed his rifle stock against the window frame, not breaking the glass, but causing a sudden, sharp, percussive sound. Vane instantly released Judith and spun toward the window, pulling his pistol. "The professor!" he screamed. Judith, regaining her footing, didn't run. She ran to the shelf where the ledgers were stacked. She grabbed a handful of the heavy books, at least 5 of them, and with a cry of effort, hurled them across the hall, scattering their pages and documents everywhere. Vane let out a terrifying, guttural howl of rage at the defilement of his sacred documents. He was torn between shooting Elias and recovering his life's work. This gave Elias the second opening. He fired his rifle, not at Vane, but at the lantern hanging near the entrance. The shot was precise. The lantern exploded in a shower of sparks and oil, plunging the entire hole into instant, absolute darkness. Chaos. "He's inside. The ledgers! Get the ledgers!" Vane screamed, his voice distorted by panic. Elias crashed through the broken window frame, the sound of splintering wood covering his entry. He grabbed Judith, pulling her toward the back door of the hall, away from the enraged Vane. "Go to the north wall, the gate!" Elias hissed. "Don't stop." As they fled, the sound of the chief enforcer's heavy footsteps thundered across the courtyard, alerted by the gunfire. Elias had the evidence, the ally, and the terror of the cult closing in on them. They were running not just from Vane, but from an entire organization built on a foundation of horrific human evil. You've seen the cult, the confession, and the escape. The mystery of the Macabre Voyages is almost solved, but the terror is at its peak. If you haven't yet, subscribe now so you don't miss the thrilling final chapters and the ultimate fate of Silas Vane. Elias and Judith burst out of the central hall and sprinted across the dark compound. The chief enforcer was already heading toward the hall, but the chaos and darkness bought them precious seconds. "The north gate!" Judith gasped, clutching her bandaged arm. "It's old, the latch sticks. We can buy time." They reached the gate, a heavy, splintered wooden structure. While Judith struggled with the stubborn bolt, Elias turned, leveling his rifle. He heard Vane's voice, now closer, cold and dangerously controlled. "The path of the betrayer leads only to the final reckoning, Judith." The enforcer was closing in, a massive silhouette against the pale moonlight. Elias fired a warning shot, aiming near the enforcer's feet, kicking up dust and forcing the man to briefly duck. "It's open!" Judith yelled. They slipped through the gate, not stopping to secure it, but turning immediately to a deep, narrow ravine that ran down the side of the mesa. It was a sheer drop, an unmapped escape route that only someone intimately familiar with the compound would know. They scrambled down the ravine, the loose scree and stones cascading around them, their escape illuminated by the pale, cold moonlight. Elias shielded Judith, who was weakening rapidly from her self-inflicted wound and the sheer terror. "Where is your mule?" Judith asked, her breath ragged. "Half a mile north of the base, hidden near the sentinel," Elias answered. "Vane will anticipate that. He'll take the road. We go south." Judith determined, her resolve hardening despite her pain. He never expects anyone to go south. That leads only to the salt flats. It's madness, but it's the only unmapped direction. The decision was made. The salt flats, a vast, desolate expanse of white alkali devoid of water, a place where direction and vision failed completely. It was the ultimate metaphor for Vane's aimless victims. As they reached the base of the mesa, they heard the terrifying sound of horses galloping on the road above. Vane and the enforcer had mobilized. They started their desperate trek south. The terrain was brutal, deep sand and sharp, scrubby brush that tore at their clothes. Elias carried the rifle and the precious ledger, now wrapped in a waterproof oilcloth. "Silas Vane," Elias pressed, trying to keep Judith focused on the truth. "Who else is with him? The people in the hall, are they killers?" "No," Judith shook her head. "They are disciples. They believe his philosophy. They are the financiers and the observers. But the true acts, the voyages, are only done by Vane and the enforcer, a man named Cale. They rotate the ritual. They believe the act of taking the vision confirms their own." "And you?" Elias asked gently. Tears streamed down her dusty face. "I was his assistant at the university. He hired me to transcribe his notes, to help him draft his magnum opus. I believed him at first about the philosophy, the need for order. Then, I saw the first collection. He trapped me. He said my vision was flawed and I had to prove my loyalty or become a failure myself." She pointed to her arm. "That was my answer." As the sun began to rise, turning the sky a blinding white, they reached the edge of the salt flats. The sight was overwhelming. A perfectly flat, endless white wasteland, shimmering under the brutal morning sun. The air was dry, and the horizon vanished into a white haze. "This is Vane's ideal landscape," Elias noted grimly. "A place where the eyes are useless, where the path disappears. He won't follow us in a carriage," Judith said. "But he knows we'll die of thirst within a day." Elias pulled out his map case. It was useless here. There was no terrain to chart. He realized the broken compass symbol was never just about philosophy. It was a deadly practical guide to this very landscape, the place where the compass fails. Suddenly a shot rang out, impossibly close. They dove behind a small, desiccated bush. Silas Vane stood on the ridge of a low hill, having abandoned the carriage and flanked by Kyle, the enforcer. Vane was no longer the orator, he was a hunter. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, his rifle glinting in the sun. He didn't bother to approach, he just stood there using the high ground. "You have chosen the path of the void, Professor," Vane shouted, his voice carrying clearly on the dry air. "No map can save you now. The salt flats are the graveyard of the aimless." Elias knew the truth of Vane's words. The heat, the lack of water, and the disorientation of the flat white expanse would kill them long before Vane had to fire another shot. He had to find a way to make the broken compass point. The sun hung directly overhead, a merciless molten orb, and the salt flats had become a blinding, shimmering hell. The vast, flat expanse of white alkali reflected the light with such intensity that the heat was a palpable force, squeezing the air from Elias's lungs. He and Judith were trapped, pinned down near the edge by Silas Vane and Cale, facing a lethal march into a terrain designed for disorientation and death. Every breath felt like inhaling dust and fire. "We have to move now," Elias whispered, his voice thin and dry, squinting against the overwhelming glare. "We can't stay here. If we get out a mile, the heat will create mirages. They won't be able to track us visually." Judith slumped slightly, her lips cracked and bleeding, her eyes glazed with dehydration and fear. "They'll track our movement until we collapse," she countered, the knowledge of this land a cold, heavy blanket of despair. "He knows this land. He trained his people here. He thinks it's his domain, the laboratory of failed vision." Elias pulled out the ledger, the heavy bound book secured under his coat. He flipped through the anatomical sketches and philosophical rants, the parchment almost too hot to touch. His gaze caught on one of Vane's detailed diagrams of the human eye. It wasn't just simple anatomy, it was a complex geometrical analysis of visual perception and refraction, a terrifying scientific study of how the eye lies to the brain under duress. Vane had obsessed over how the eye failed in conditions of extreme light and heat. He had scientifically charted the exact conditions required to produce a convincing mirage. It wasn't just a natural phenomenon to him, it was a weapon. He didn't just study failure, Judith, Elias realized, a spark of cold, professional hope igniting in his weary eyes. He studied deception. He knows exactly what the eye sees and what it thinks it sees out here. The broken compass is his personal code for manipulating this environment. Elias needed a map of deception. He needed to turn Vane's own distorted intellectual science against him. Vane is relying on the optical distortion, Elias explained rapidly, trying to inject urgency into his parched voice. The mirage will make them believe we are closer, or moving in directions we are not. Our eyes will deceive us, and so will theirs. We need a landmark, a fixed point, something that breaks the illusion. There was nothing, only the perfect, endless white flatness. The world had dissolved into a single, terrifying dimension. Then Elias remembered the unique, custom-made boots Vane wore, the large, heavy, unmistakable tracks he had followed for miles. They were the one consistent physical truth in this landscape of lies. We create our own fixed point, Elias declared, a grim determination settling on his face. We use our tracks. We make them believe the path they see is the path we took. The plan was insane, a desperate last-ditch tactical maneuver, but logically flawless, relying on Vane's intellectual arrogance. They would walk backward. The heat is greatest now, Elias instructed, pulling Judith up. The shallow water beneath the salt crust is steaming, increasing the refraction. We'll leave 2 sets of fresh, deep footprints, facing away from the ridge, a clear line of flight. Then, we crawl laterally along the ground for 50 yards, leaving no trace, before walking away on a completely different vector. Judith, summoning a deep well of survival instinct, nodded, her terror replaced by cold resolve. The fresh tracks, magnified and distorted by the shimmering mirage, would give Vane a clear, false path to follow. The optical illusion of the salt flats would complete the deception. Vane would be so certain of his superior vision and his philosophical superiority that he would not doubt the direction. He would see what he expected to see. 2 panicked, aimless failures fleeing blindly into the void. They executed the plan with agonizing, whispered care. They walked backward for 100 yards, their footsteps sinking deep into the salt crust, creating a compelling, straight line leading directly into the center of the endless white. Elias made sure the footprints looked staggered, like the tracks of 2 utterly exhausted people fleeing without reason or plan. Then they dropped to the ground, scraping their bodies along the rough salt crust, moving perpendicular to the false trail. The process was slow, painful, and dangerously exposed. The salt tore at their clothes and skin, and the reflection from the ground threatened to burn their exposed eyes. Every slow, lateral inch was an exercise in pure will. When they were 50 yards away, hidden in the glare, they stood up and began walking diagonally, heading toward a subtle, distant discoloration on the horizon that might indicate a small rise or a change in the crust. They looked back. Vane and Cale were moving. Vane, rifle at the ready, descended the ridge. He paused at the 2 sets of footprints, his gaze fixed on the deceptive tracks stretching out into the shimmering distance. Elias could almost hear Vane's internal monologue, a self-congratulatory sneer about the predictability of the morally blind. Vane was so certain of his twisted mathematical philosophy that he was utterly blind to the possibility of a tactical move. He had confused the map of the mind with the map of the ground. Vane gave a sharp, confident command to Cale, pointing straight ahead. The two men broke into a jog, following the backward-leading footprints, their figures quickly distorted by the heat haze and the endless white expanse. They were following the cartographer's final map, a terrifying diagram made of false tracks and fatal optical illusion. Elias and Judith continued their diagonal trek, the sun beating down mercilessly. They gained almost half a mile before Vane and Kyle realized their error. The sight of Vane stopping, his form contorted by the mirage, turning in confusion and pure, unadulterated rage, was a moment of terrifying, fleeting triumph. He had been beaten by the logic of the map he thought he controlled. His philosophical system had been proven false by a simple physical trick. But Vane was a fanatic, and fanaticism quickly curdles into a desperate need for revenge. He dropped his gaze from the false trail and scanned the horizon, his rifle coming up. He located the small, distant figures of Elias and Judith. He raised his rifle, aiming not for Elias, the intellectual threat, but for Judith, the ultimate betrayer of his vision and his most vulnerable target. "Judith!" Elias yelled, his voice a raw rasp, tackling her just as the rifle cracked. The bullet hissed past, kicking up a spray of white salt where her head had been moments before. Vane was no longer pursuing a philosophical point, he was simply executing a perceived traitor. The chase had turned into a deadly, inevitable firing line, deep in the one place where Vane felt truly dominant, a psychological killing field. The end was no longer a matter of distance, but a matter of time. The shock of the near-fatal shot, combined with the extreme heat, jolted Elias and Judith with a fresh, desperate surge of adrenaline. They scrambled to their feet, ignoring the searing pain in their muscles and the raw ache in their throats. Vane and Cale were still a dangerous distance away, their figures appearing and disappearing in the haze, but the fanatic's rage was a force that gave them relentless, terrifying energy. They knew Vane would close the gap swiftly, driven by humiliation and the need for a final, horrific vengeance. "We can't outrun them, Elias," Judith choked out, collapsing after only a few desperate strides onto the salt crust, trying to cup her hands over her stinging eyes. "The water. We have to conserve energy. We're losing ground." Elias scanned the horizon, fighting the urge to rub his own watering eyes. The distant discoloration was getting closer, growing from a smudge into a defined, dark, low-lying rock formation, a cairn of immense size thrust up from the salt bed. It was the only fixed, stable object in the entire landscape of lies. "Vane's philosophy," Elias panted, hoisting Judith to her feet and forcing her forward. "It's all about direction and sight. That rock is the only thing that doesn't move. It's the only thing Vane couldn't account for in his map of failure, the immutable truth of geology." They struggled toward the rock, dragging themselves through the oppressive heat. Vane and Cale were now visibly closer, closing the distance with terrifying speed, having abandoned all pretense of subtlety. "He's going to corner us there," Judith warned, her voice thick with panic. "I know," Elias said, his voice quiet but absolute. "But that rock is the only place where the compass works, the only place where vision is not distorted by the heat and the salt. It's our final stand and our final beacon." They reached the massive, isolated rock. It was split by a deep, narrow fissure, a dark, natural shelter offering a moment's respite from the overwhelming light. Elias pushed Judith inside, positioning her behind the thick stone. As Vane and Cale reached the rock, they split up, flanking the formation and effectively pinning Elias against the sheer rock face. Vane, his custom boots scuffing the salt, smiled, a chilling, triumphant grimace that held no warmth or humanity. He had regained his chilling composure, relishing the finality of the trap. "The ultimate failure, Professor Vance," Vane proclaimed, his voice booming with manic clarity. "Trapped by the very truth you sought to map. The fixed point where all aimless paths end, a fitting grave for a meddling cartographer and a faithless disciple." Elias pulled the ledger from his coat, holding it up like a shield. "No, Vane. This is the truth. Your confession, your map of insanity." "The paper will burn," Vane sneered, raising his rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. "No one will believe a few words scribbled by a lost cartographer who vanished in the salt flats." "But they will believe her," Elias stated, his eyes boring into Vane's, before deliberately pointing past Vane to the far side of the flats. Vane hesitated, his confidence momentarily shaken by Elias's unexpected calm. He slowly turned, and his triumphant expression fractured into utter, disbelieving horror. On the far horizon, tiny but distinct, was a line of dark shapes. A massive convoy of wagons. It was Jedediah's main convoy, having been forced by an unexpected dust storm and navigational error to deviate from the Oregon Trail and push south. They were exactly where Elias's initial, theoretical estimation had placed them, and more importantly, they were close enough, and the light now clear enough near the rock to be staring directly at the confrontation at the only fixed point for miles. Judith, seizing the moment, emerged from the crevice, her voice ringing out clearly across the salt air, amplified by the natural acoustics of the rock. "He is Silas Vane. He murdered them for their eyes. The ledgers are the proof. They are all here. He is mad." Vane was momentarily paralyzed by the shock of his ultimate exposure. His secret, his life's work, his carefully maintained philosophy of elitist murder was exposed not to one man, but to a collective, organized witness. The human element he had so coldly exploited, the community of travelers he had dismissed as aimless failures, was now his judge and jury. Kyle, the enforcer, reacted with the ingrained, brutal efficiency of a killer, ignoring the distant threat and aiming his rifle directly at Judith, the source of the public accusation. Elias had anticipated this final, desperate act. He lunged forward not at Vane, but toward Kyle. He tackled the massive man, sending both of them sprawling onto the salt crust, disrupting Kyle's aim. Kyle's rifle discharged harmlessly into the sky. Vane, seeing his escape and his philosophical foundation crumble into the dust, turned his rifle back on Elias. But before he could fire, a single sharp crack of a rifle echoed from the convoy. Jedediah, the grizzled wagon master, had seen the weapon leveled at the woman. The shot, precise and fueled by frontier justice, was aimed at Vane's rifle, shattering the wooden stock and throwing the weapon from his hands. With his philosophical foundation destroyed, his evidence exposed, and his weapon gone, Vane did not surrender. He screamed in a final terrifying fit of absolute rage and despair, charging blindly toward Elias, determined to physically destroy the cartographer who had mapped his madness and exposed his lie. Elias, exhausted but resolute, drew his heavy surveying compass, the one piece of precise equipment Vane's cult had sought to pervert into a symbol of moral failure, and slammed the heavy brass base into the side of Vane's temple. Vane collapsed onto the blinding white salt, unconscious, his custom-made boots failing to carry him to his final, insane goal. Kale, seeing his leader fall and the rest of the convoy, armed travelers and now organized marshals, closing in rapidly, dropped his rifle and slowly raised his hands in surrender. Hours later, as the convoy arrived and the sun began its descent, casting long, merciful shadows across the flats, the horror of the Macabre Voyages finally ended. Silas Vane, bound and raving about his righteous path and the failures who judged him, was taken into custody, along with Kale. The multiple ledgers, retrieved by the brave Judith, provided incontrovertible evidence of the elaborate human conspiracy that had terrorized the Oregon Trail for years. Elias Vance, the cartographer, stood beside the fixed point, handing the primary ledger to a federal marshal who had been traveling with the convoy. His face was etched with exhaustion, but his eyes, though strained by the salt, held a profound clarity. He had mapped the final, terrifying truth. The greatest horror in the Wild West was not the untamed wilderness or the rumors of savage threats, but the calculated, sophisticated cruelty of man. He had found his direction, not just in the lines of a map, but in the courage to face the human darkness and use logic to dismantle the illusion of terror. Elias looked at Judith, who was being tended to by a kind woman from the convoy. She was alive, free, and possessed the courage to start a new life, a life built on truth, not fear. The broken compass had been fixed not by magic, but by a simple act of human intervention and resolve. The path ahead for all travelers was now known, charted, and free of the horror that once lurked in the shadows of the unmapped trail.